The dusty road that led to the straight ranch had vanished beneath a torrent of water, transforming the familiar path home into a dark, reflective river under the flash of lightning. The storm had descended upon the Texas hill country with a ferocity that rattled the very bones of the earth. It was not merely rain. It was a deluge, a weeping of the heavens that turned the dry creek beds into raging torrents and bowed the ancient oak trees in submission. Inside the sprawling main house, the atmosphere was warm and insulated, a sanctuary built from decades of hard work, chart-topping hits, and the kind of enduring love that people write songs about but rarely live. George sat in his favorite leather armchair, the one that had molded to his shape over the years. He was older now. The lines around his eyes were deeper, etched by smiles and squinting into stage lights, and his hair held the silver of a life fully lived. He held a book in his hands, but his eyes were not on the pages. They were fixed on the fire crackling in the stone hearth, listening to the wind howl against the sturdy walls of the home he had built for her. Norma was standing by the massive bay window that overlooked the south lawn. She had always loved the rain. In the early days, when they had nothing, the rain meant the grass would grow, the cattle would feed, and they might just scrape by for another season. Now, the rain was simply a backdrop, a dramatic curtain falling over their kingdom. She held a delicate porcelain teacup in her hands, the steam rising in curling ribbons that disappeared against the cold glass. The room was silent, save for the crackle of the fire and the distant, muffled roar of the thunder. George watched her silhouette. After 50 years, she was still the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. She was his anchor. Without Norma, there was no George Strait. There was just a cowboy with a guitar who would have given up a long time ago. Suddenly, the rhythm of the room shattered. The sound was sharp and shocking, the crash of porcelain against the hardwood floor. George flinched, the book sliding from his lap as he sat up straight. It wasn't like Norma to be clumsy. She possessed a grace that was innate, a poise that had carried them through red carpets and rodeo dust alike. He looked towards the window. Norma hadn't moved to clean up the mess. The tea was spreading across the polished wood, soaking into the expensive rug, but she stood frozen, her hand still raised as if holding a ghost cup, her fingers trembling. George was on his feet in an instant, crossing the room with the long, steady strides of a man used to handling emergencies. He reached her side, his hand gently touching her shoulder. Her skin was cold, and when he looked at her face, he saw a pallor that terrified him. Her eyes were wide, fixed on something out in the darkness, something beyond the sheets of rain hammering against the glass. "Norma, are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and steady, trying to cut through her shock. She didn't look at him. She couldn't break her gaze from the yard. Her voice, when it came, was a whisper so fragile it barely rose above the sound of the storm. "George, look out there. Tell me that isn't there. Please, tell me I am dreaming." George frowned, concern etching deep furrows in his forehead. He turned his head to follow her gaze. The exterior lights of the mansion were on, casting a wide, golden glow that usually illuminated the manicured lawn, the prize-winning rose bushes, and the gravel path leading to the stables. But tonight, the light struggled against the density of the rain. At first, he saw nothing but the gray sheets of water and the swaying branches of the pecan trees. He squinted, his eyes adjusting to the chaotic dance of shadows and light. Then, he saw it. His breath hitched in his throat, a physical reaction so violent it felt like a blow to the chest. He gripped the windowsill, his knuckles turning white. It was impossible. It was physically, logically, completely impossible. Standing in the middle of their perfect, multi-million-dollar lawn, right where the pristine gazebo usually stood, was a shack. But it wasn't just any shack. George knew every warped board, every rusted nail, every gap in the siding of that structure. It was the Cedar Cabin, the first home they had ever shared. The place they had lived in 1974, when he was a nobody trying to figure out if he could feed his wife on dreams and honky-tonk tips. It was a small, pathetic thing, barely holding itself together against the wind. The wood was gray and weathered, the tin roof rusted and patched with tar. The front porch sagged dangerously to the left, supported by a stack of cinder blocks they had scavenged from a construction site. It was the house of their poverty. It was the house of their beginning. But that wasn't what made George's blood run cold. What froze him was the fact that they had burned that cabin down. In 1975, when they finally saved enough money to move to a rental with indoor plumbing that actually worked, they had celebrated by setting a match to the old, termite-ridden structure. He had watched it turn to ash. He had bulldozed the remains himself. He had smoothed the earth over it. That cabin had ceased to exist 45 years ago. Yet, there it stood, solid, real. Rain was bouncing off its tin roof, and there was a light in the window. It wasn't the cold, blue light of electricity. It was the warm, flickering, orange glow of a kerosene lamp. The same kerosene lamp they used to light when they couldn't afford to pay the electric bill. George felt Norma's hand grip his forearm. Her nails dug into his shirt. "It's back," she whispered. "George, why is it back?" George couldn't speak. His mind was racing, trying to find a rational explanation. Was it a prank? Had someone built a replica? But no replica could capture the specific way the chimney leaned, or the exact pattern of rot on the bottom of the doorframe. That was their cabin. It was as if time had folded in on itself, dropping a piece of their past right onto their front lawn. "I don't know," George said, his voice rough. "I don't know, honey." He stared at the light in the window. It beckoned to him. It pulled at him with a magnetic force that was stronger than fear. It was a feeling he hadn't felt in decades. The feeling of hunger, of desperation, of youth. "I have to go out there," George said. The words left his mouth before he had even decided to say them. Norma turned to him then, tears streaming down her face, mixing with the shock. She didn't tell him not to go. She didn't tell him he was crazy. She knew him too well. She knew that George Strait never backed down from a mystery, and he never turned away from his past. "I'm coming with you," she said. George looked at her. She was wearing a silk blouse and slacks, dressed for a quiet evening in, not for a trek through a muddy tempest. "Norma, it's pouring out there. You'll catch your death." "I am not letting you walk back into that house alone," she said firmly. "If that is our past out there, George, we face it together, just like we always have." He nodded slowly. He grabbed his heavy canvas coat from the rack by the door and draped it over her shoulders. It swallowed her small frame, smelling of horses and leather. He put on his own hat, pulling the brim low. He didn't bother with a raincoat for himself. The rain felt appropriate. It felt like a baptism. They opened the heavy oak front door, and the roar of the storm invaded the house. The wind tried to push them back, but George took Norma's hand, interlacing his fingers with hers. Her grip was strong. It was the same grip that had held him when his first records failed. The same grip that held him when they lost their daughter. The same grip that had been the only constant in a life of chaos. They stepped out onto the porch and then down the stairs. Immediately, the cold rain soaked them. The expensive landscaping of their current life disappeared, replaced by the mud and the dark. As they walked away from the mansion, the lights of the big house seemed to dim, as if the present world was fading away, leaving only the impossible reality of the cabin ahead of them. The walk across the lawn felt like it took hours. With every step, the air changed. The smell of ozone and wet manicured grass faded. It was replaced by scents that George hadn't smelled in years, scents that hit him in the gut with the force of a physical blow. He smelled wet cedar wood. He smelled the pungent, earthy aroma of raw mud. And then, drifting on the wind, coming from the cracks in the cabin walls, came a smell that brought tears to his eyes instantly. Pinto beans. It was the smell of pinto beans simmering on a wood stove. Beans seasoned with nothing but salt and a piece of fatback, because that was all they could afford. It was the smell of their survival. It was the smell of dinners eaten in silence, because they were too tired to talk, and dinners eaten in laughter, because they were young and in love and didn't know how hard life could get. George squeezed Norma's hand. He felt her trembling, not from the cold, but from the memory. "Do you smell that?" he asked, shouting over the wind. "Beans!" she cried back, her voice breaking. "George, it smells like supper!" They were 50 yards away now. The cabin loomed before them, dark and wet, except for that single flickering window. The rain hammered against the tin roof, a rhythm that George knew better than any drumbeat he had ever recorded. It was the rhythm of insomnia, of nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if he would ever make it. And then a new sound joined the rain. It was faint at first, easily mistaken for the wind whistling through the eaves. But as they got closer, the sound sharpened. It became distinct. It was a melody. George stopped walking. Norma stopped with him. They stood in the mud, the rain plastering their clothes to their bodies, listening. It was a guitar. But it wasn't the rich, resonant sound of the custom-made Gibsons George played now. It was a cheap sound, tinny. The strings were old and likely rusted. The wood of the guitar was thin. It was the sound of a pawn-shop instrument played by hands that were calloused and tired. The playing was clumsy, hesitant. It would start a progression, stumble, stop, and start again. It was the sound of a songwriter struggling to find the hook. It was the sound of frustration. George knew that playing style. He knew those mistakes. He knew the exact hesitation between the G chord and the C chord. "It's me," George whispered. The realization washed over him, colder than the rain. "That's me playing." Norma looked at him, her eyes wide with terror and wonder. "But George, you are here. You are holding my hand." "I know," he said, "but that is me. I know how I used to play when I was angry. I hit the bass strings too hard. Listen." They listened. Inside the cabin, the guitar player struck the low E string with a force that made the instrument buzz and rattle. A curse followed, a young man's voice, muffled by the walls, shouting in frustration. "Damn it!" The voice was undeniable. It was George, but not the George of today. It was George at 22, the George who was working cattle by day and playing honky-tonks for beer money by night, the George who was drowning in doubt. They began to walk again, drawn moth-like to the light in the window. The mud sucked at their boots, trying to hold them back, but they pushed forward. The closer they got, the more the years seemed to peel away. George felt the phantom ache in his back from bucking hay bales. He felt the ghost of a blister on his thumb. They reached the edge of the porch. The cinder blocks were slick with moss. The wood of the steps was rotted through in places. George remembered exactly which step to skip, the third one. If you stepped on the third one, it would snap. Without thinking, he guided Norma over it, his muscle memory taking over after 4 decades. They stood on the porch, sheltered from the direct rain by the leaking tin roof. Water dripped down George's nose. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was inches away from the door. He could reach out and touch the rough, splintered wood. Inside, the guitar had stopped. There was the sound of a chair scraping against the floorboards, heavy boots pacing. "I can't do this anymore," the voice inside said. It was clear now. It was young George. Norma squeezed George's hand so hard it hurt. She moved towards the window. The glass was old, wavy, and covered in condensation. But there was a spot near the bottom that had been wiped clear. "Don't look," George whispered, a sudden surge of protective instinct rising. He was afraid of what seeing the past would do to them. Memories were one thing. Seeing ghosts was another. "We have to," Norma said. "We are here for a reason, George. Look." She pulled him down. They crouched by the window of their own past, the rain curtaining them off from the rest of the world. George held his breath. He leaned forward, his face inches from the cold glass. He looked through the portal of time, into the dim, yellow light of the room. The interior was sparse. A table with one uneven leg propped up by a folded matchbook, a cast-iron stove in the corner, a mattress on the floor in the back room. And there, sitting on a wooden crate, hunched over a battered guitar, was a young man. He was thin, wire-thin. His hair was longer, unruly. He wore a flannel shirt that had been mended at the elbows and jeans that were white at the knees from work. He had his head in his hands. The guitar lay precariously on his lap, as if he were about to let it slide to the floor and never pick it up again. George stared at his younger self. He remembered this night. He remembered the despair. It was 1974. He had just been turned down by another record label in Nashville. They had told him he wasn't traditional enough, or maybe he was too traditional. He couldn't remember the excuse, only the rejection. He had come home to this shack, to his wife who was pregnant with their first child, with empty pockets and a broken heart. The young George inside the cabin lifted his head. His face was wet. He wasn't crying, not openly, but there was a sheen of sweat and rain on his skin, and his eyes were red-rimmed. He looked at the ceiling, shouting at God or the roof. It didn't matter. "It's over," the young man said. "I'm done. I'm selling the guitar tomorrow. I'll take the foreman job at the ranch in Cotulla. I can't drag her through this starvation anymore." Old George, watching from the window, felt a tear slide down his own cheek. He remembered the weight of that decision. He remembered the crushing guilt of feeling like a failure as a husband. He wanted to scream through the glass. He wanted to bang on the window and yell, "Don't do it! Hang on, son! You have no idea what's coming!" But he couldn't make a sound. He was a spectator to his own history. Then, the door to the back room of the cabin opened. A young woman stepped into the light. She was wearing a cotton nightgown that had seen better days, wrapped in a shawl that she had knitted herself. Her hair was loose, falling down her back in dark waves. She looked tired, exhausted even, but her eyes were fierce. It was Norma, young Norma. She walked over to the young man on the crate. She didn't say a word at first. She just placed her hand on his shoulder. The young George flinched, as if her touch burned him. "I'm quitting, Norma," he said to her, not looking up. "I'm done dreaming. It's selfish." Old Norma, standing in the rain, let out a soft sob. She pressed her hand against the glass, trying to touch the image of her younger self. George watched the scene unfold. This was the moment. This was the night everything changed. He had remembered it as a blur, a vague turning point. But seeing it now, in high definition, illuminated by the kerosene lamp, he realized he had forgotten the most important part. He had always told the story that he decided to keep going. But looking through the window, he realized that wasn't true. He hadn't decided anything. Inside the cabin, young Norma knelt down on the dirty floorboards. She didn't care about the dust. She took young George's face in her hands and forced him to look at her. The fire in the stove cast dancing shadows on their faces. "You listen to me, George Harvey Strait," young Norma said. Her voice was muffled through the glass, but the steel in her tone cut through the storm outside. Old George held his breath. He needed to hear this. He needed to remember what she had said. The rain continued to fall in sheets, a relentless curtain of water that seemed determined to wash the world clean. But George and Norma stood rooted in the mud, oblivious to the cold seeping into their bones. They were suspended in a space between worlds, two ghosts haunting their own history, pressing their faces against the fragile barrier of glass that separated the wealthy icons they had become from the desperate children they used to be. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with a tension so palpable it seemed to distort the light of the kerosene lamp. Young George sat on the crate, his shoulders slumped forward, his posture that of a man who had carried the weight of the world for too long and finally collapsed under it. He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous, agitated gesture that old George recognized with a pang of heartache. It was the same gesture he used to make before going on stage in the early days, back when stage fright was a physical sickness in his gut. "I'm selling the guitar, Norma," young George said again, his voice cracking. He didn't look at her. He looked at his boots, worn-out leather boots with soles that were separating from the uppers. "I ran into Mr. Henderson in town today. He said the foreman job in Cotulla is still open. It pays $300 a month. $300, Norma, guaranteed, every month." He looked up then, and the desperation in his eyes was terrifying. "We could buy groceries, real groceries, not just beans and whatever this is. We could buy clothes for the baby. I can't bring a child into this, Norma. Look around you. The roof leaks, the wind comes through the walls. I am a failure." Old George, watching from the dark, felt his knees weaken. He gripped the window frame for support. He remembered the shame. It came flooding back to him, a bitter taste in his mouth. He remembered the feeling of being a man who couldn't provide, a cowboy with no cattle and a singer with no song. He had buried that feeling deep under platinum records and sold-out stadiums, but it had never truly left. It was the engine that had driven him for 40 years, the terror of going back to this moment. "I'm just a guy with a guitar," young George whispered, his voice thick with self-loathing. "There are a million guys with guitars in Texas. I'm not special. I'm just stubborn, and my stubbornness is starving you." Inside the room, young Norma stood up. She had been kneeling, but now she rose to her full height. She was small, petite even, but in that flickering light, she looked 10 feet tall. She walked over to the stove, picked up a rag, and wiped her hands. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She was gathering her strength. Old Norma, standing in the rain, whispered, tell him what I told you." Her voice was fierce, her eyes locked on her younger self. Young Norma turned to her husband. She walked over to him and placed her hands on his knees, forcing him to look at her. "Are you finished?" she asked softly. Young George blinked, confused by her tone. "Norma, I'm trying to be realistic. I'm trying to be a husband." "I didn't ask you to be realistic," young Norma said, her voice rising. "And I didn't marry a foreman. I married you. I married the man who sings to me on the porch when the sun goes down. I married the man who can make a room full of drunk cowboys stop drinking and listen just by opening his mouth." "That doesn't pay the bills," young George shouted, standing up and knocking the crate over. The sound was loud, startling. Love doesn't buy diapers, Norma. Dreams don't fix the roof. He paced the small room, his shadow stretching long and distorted against the wooden walls. I am tired of seeing you wear the same dress every day. I am tired of seeing you pretend you're not hungry so I can eat more. Do you think I don't know? Do you think I don't see you pushing the food around on your plate? Old George felt a sob rip through his chest. He hadn't known. Or maybe he had chosen not to see it back then. The realization hit him like a physical blow. She had starved herself for him. She had hidden her hunger so he would have the strength to work, to sing, to travel. He turned his head to look at the white-haired woman standing next to him in the rain. She was watching the scene with a sad, tender smile. "You never told me," old George choked out. "You needed the strength more than I did," old Norma whispered, not taking her eyes off the window. Inside the cabin, young Norma didn't back down from his anger. She waited for him to stop pacing. Then she did something that made old George's heart stop. She walked over to a loose floorboard in the corner of the room, near the mattress. She pried it up with her fingernails. From the dark hollow beneath the floor, she pulled out a small, rusted tin can. It was an old coffee tin. Young George stopped pacing. "What is that?" Young Norma walked over to the table and dumped the contents of the tin. Coins, crumpled dollar bills, a few fives. It wasn't a fortune, but for them, at that time, it was a significant amount. "I've been taking in sewing," she said quietly. "Mrs. Miller's dresses, hemming pants for the ranch hands. I've been saving, George, every penny I could." Young George stared at the money. "How long?" "6 months," she said. "There is enough here for the electric bill, enough for flour and sugar, enough for gas to get you to that audition in Nashville next month. Norma." Young George slumped against the wall, the fight draining out of him. "Why?" "Because I believe in you," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Because when you sing, George, the world makes sense. And I will not let you kill that part of yourself just to make life a little easier for me. I don't want easy. I want you, all of you. The dreamer, the singer, the king." She didn't know she had used the title that the world would one day give him. She just used it as a term of endearment. But outside the window, the word hung in the air like a prophecy. Young George looked at the money, then at her. Tears were streaming down his face now, unashamedly. "I'm scared, Norma. I'm terrified. What if I never make it? What if we are old and still living in a shack like this?" Young Norma crossed the room and took his face in her hands. She wiped his tears with her thumbs. "Then we will be old and poor and in love," she said firmly. "And you will still sing to me, and that will be enough. But you are not going to quit. Not tonight, not tomorrow. You are going to pick up that guitar and you are going to write. You are going to write about this pain. You are going to write about this rain. You are going to turn this struggle into something beautiful." Old George watched, mesmerized. He had told the story 1,000 times in interviews. "My wife supported me." But he had reduced it to a soundbite. He had forgotten the visceral reality of it. He had forgotten the fire in her eyes. He had forgotten that she literally bought his career with hemmed pants and secret savings. Inside the cabin, young George took a deep breath. He looked at the guitar lying on the floor where he had almost discarded it. He looked at the woman standing before him, her chin high, her eyes burning with a faith he didn't possess himself. Slowly, painfully, he bent down and picked up the instrument. He sat back down on the crate, which he righted with his foot. He cradled the guitar against his chest like a shield. He strummed a chord. G major. It rang out, clean and true, cutting through the sound of the storm. "Play," young Norma commanded softly. "Play for me." Young George closed his eyes. His fingers moved over the fretboard. He began to pick a melody. It was simple, mournful, yet filled with a strange hope. It was a melody that old George hadn't thought of in 40 years. It was the melody of a song he had written that very night and never recorded. A song just for her. He began to sing, his voice rough with emotion, not the polished baritone of the superstar, but the raw, shaky tenor of the boy. The roof is leaking rain, dear. The wind is at the door. I've got a pocket full of nothing, and I can't give you more. But as long as you are with me, as long as you are near, I'll be the richest man alive, with you, my dear, right here. The voice drifted through the glass, tinny and faint, but to old George and Norma, it sounded like a symphony. It was the purest thing he had ever sung. Old George felt his wife lean heavily against him. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close into the shelter of his coat. They stood there in the torrential downpour, holding each other, watching their younger selves find salvation in a 3-minute song. "I forgot that song," old George whispered into her hair. "I completely forgot it." "I never did," Norma replied, her voice choked. "I hear it every time I look at you." Inside the room, the song ended. Young George let the final chord fade into silence. He opened his eyes and looked at his wife. The despair was gone. In its place was a steely determination, a look that said, "I will conquer the world for you." He stood up and pulled young Norma into a hug. It wasn't a gentle hug. It was a desperate embrace. Two people clinging to each other on a life raft in the middle of an ocean. He buried his face in her neck. "I promise you," young George said, his voice muffled against her skin. "I swear to you, Norma, I will make this worth it. I will buy you a house so big you'll get lost in it. I will buy you a garden where the roses never die. I will make sure you never have to sew another hem unless you want to." "I know," she whispered back. "I know you will." Old George watched the embrace, and a wave of profound gratitude washed over him, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He realized that everything he had, the ranch, the awards, the fame, the legacy, it all rested on the shoulders of that young woman in the threadbare nightgown. She was the foundation. He was just the structure built on top. "You saved me," old George said to the woman beside him. "I thought I saved myself by working hard, but it was you. It was always you." Norma looked up at him, her face wet with rain and tears. "We saved each other, George. That's what love is." They watched for a few more moments. The scene inside the cabin began to settle. Young George sat back down with the guitar, this time with a notebook and a pencil. He was writing. He was working. The crisis had passed. The timeline had been preserved. But then something shifted. The light in the cabin window flared brighter, turning from a soft orange to a blinding white. The sound of the rain seemed to fade away, replaced by a high-pitched hum, like the vibration of a tuning fork. "George," Norma said, gripping his arm, "what's happening?" The image inside the window began to ripple, like a reflection in a disturbed pond. The figures of young George and young Norma became translucent. The walls of the cabin started to shimmer. "It's fading," George said, panic rising in his chest. He didn't want it to go. He wanted to stay there, watching them, protecting them. "Wait, not yet." He reached out his hand to touch the glass, to anchor the vision, but his fingers met nothing but cold, wet air. The cabin was dissolving. The wood turned to mist. The tin roof evaporated into the rain. The light in the window shattered into a million particles of stardust that swirled in the darkness. For a moment, the outline of the cabin remained. A ghost image burned into the night. And then, with a soft sigh that sounded like the wind through cedar branches, it was gone. George and Norma were left standing alone in the middle of their vast, manicured lawn. The storm was still raging, but the silence where the cabin had been was deafening. They stood there, blinking, trying to readjust to the darkness. The gazebo was gone. The cabin was gone. There was nothing but the wet grass and the swaying trees. "Was it real?" Norma asked, her voice trembling. "Did we just imagine that?" George looked down at the ground where the cabin had stood. He shone the small flashlight he kept on his keychain, a habit from years of ranch life. The beam cut through the darkness and illuminated a patch of mud. There, in the center of where the cabin floor would have been, something was sticking out of the ground. It wasn't a ghost. It was solid. George walked over to it, his boots squelching in the mud. He knelt down, ignoring the pain in his knees. Norma knelt beside him. It was a sapling, a small, fragile cedar tree, no more than a foot high. It looked freshly planted, its needles bright green against the dark earth. And tied around the base of the sapling, half buried in the mud, was something that glittered in the flashlight beam. George reached out and brushed the mud away. His fingers closed around a cold, metal object. He pulled it free and held it up to the light. It was a guitar pick. But not just any pick. It was a tortoiseshell pick, the kind they stopped making years ago. The kind George used to use in the 70s because he claimed they gave a warmer sound. He had lost his last one in 1975, right before they moved out of the cabin. He held the pick in his trembling palm, water pooling around it. He looked at Norma, his eyes wide with wonder. "It was real," he whispered. "It was real, and they left us a sign." Norma touched the small cedar tree. "A new beginning," she said softly, "planted on the ashes of the old." The storm began to break. The thunder rolled away into the distance, leaving behind a steady, gentle rain. The adrenaline that had fueled them began to fade, replaced by a deep, exhausting peace. "Let's go inside," George said, helping his wife to her stand. "I need to dry you off. And then I have something I need to do." They walked back towards the mansion, the lights of their home welcoming them back. But they were not the same people who had walked out an hour ago. They carried the weight of the past with them, not as a burden, but as a treasure. As they entered the warmth of the house, dripping wet and shivering, George didn't head for the towels. He didn't head for the fireplace. He walked straight to his music room. "George," Norma called out, following him, "you'll catch pneumonia." "In a minute," he called back. He walked into the room lined with gold records and awards. He ignored them all. He walked past the expensive, custom guitars hanging on the wall. He went to the corner, to an old hard-shell case that hadn't been opened in years. He popped the latches. The smell of old wood and memories rose up to meet him. He lifted out his old Guild acoustic, the one he had bought right after he got his first record deal. It wasn't the cheap one from the cabin, that one was long gone, but it was the closest thing he had. He sat down on the stool, still wearing his wet coat, water dripping onto the floor. He held the tortoiseshell pick between his fingers. It felt perfect. It felt like coming home. Norma stood in the doorway, watching him. She knew better than to interrupt. She saw the look in his eyes. It was the look of the young man in the cabin. George tuned the guitar. His hands were cold, but his fingers were nimble. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and let the silence of the house settle around him. Then he began to play. The first chord George struck on the old Guild guitar was not perfect. His fingers were stiff from the cold rain, and the calluses, though still there after decades of playing, were softened by the water. The sound that emerged was raw, buzzing slightly against the fretboard, a stark contrast to the polished, studio-perfect tones the world was accustomed to hearing from the king of country. But to George, in that dimly lit music room, it sounded like the most honest thing he had played in 20 years. He sat on the stool, his wet coat dripping onto the Persian rug, a puddle forming around his boots. He didn't care. The house, usually kept at a pristine temperature, felt irrelevant. The only heat that mattered was the fire rekindling in his chest, sparked by the vision of his younger self shivering in a shack. He adjusted his grip on the tortoiseshell pick, the artifact from the past that burned cold against his thumb, and struck the strings again. This time, the rhythm caught. It was the same progression he had heard through the rainy window of the cabin. G, C, D, back to G. The cowboy chords. The building blocks of every heartache and every joy ever sung in a Texas honky-tonk. He closed his eyes, tilting his head back, and let the melody flow out of him. It wasn't just a song, it was a conversation with the boy he used to be. Norma stood in the doorway, a thick wool blanket in her hands. She had dried her face, but her hair was still damp, clinging to her cheeks. She watched her husband, the man the world called a legend, stripped of his accolades, stripped of his stardom, sitting there soaking wet and playing with the desperation of a 20-year-old who needed to pay the light bill. She didn't move to stop him. She knew that the music had to come out. It was the only way he could process the impossible thing they had just witnessed. George began to sing, his voice low and gravelly, filling the acoustic space of the room. The roof is leaking rain. Dear, the wind is at the door. He sang the verses he had heard his younger self writing, but now, with the perspective of a lifetime, the words carried a different weight. In 1974, those lyrics were a plea, a cry of fear. Now, in 2024, they were a hymn of gratitude. He sang them not as a man afraid of drowning, but as a man who had survived the flood. As he reached the chorus, the memories flooded his mind, overlapping with the music. He remembered the smell of the tour bus diesel. He remembered the blinding lights of the Houston Astrodome. He remembered the roar of 80,000 people singing along to Amarillo by Morning. But mostly, he remembered the quiet moments, the long drives home after a show, the way Norma would look at him from the side of the stage, her silhouette the only thing grounding him when the fame threatened to sweep him away. He played for 10 minutes, improvising, extending the song, letting the guitar weep and moan. He played for the friends he had lost along the way. He played for his daughter, waiting for him on the other side. He played for the cedar cabin and the beans boiling on the stove. When the final note decayed into silence, hanging in the air like smoke, George didn't open his eyes immediately. He sat there, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling beneath the wet canvas coat. Norma walked into the room softly. She draped the wool blanket over his shoulders, covering the wet coat. She wrapped her arms around him from behind, resting her cheek against his wet back. "You still have it," she whispered. "You never lost it, George." George placed his hand over hers, gripping it tightly. "I almost did, Norma. I got comfortable. I got used to the silk sheets and the private jets. I forgot what it felt like to be hungry. I forgot that the music doesn't come from the bank account. It comes from the mud. It comes from the struggle." He turned on the stool to face her. His eyes were clear, the shock of the evening replaced by a profound, quiet clarity. "That vision out there," he said, gesturing vaguely towards the window where the storm was finally dying down. "It wasn't a haunting. It was a reminder. It was God, or the universe, or just our own memories telling us that we can't just sit in this castle and rot. We have a debt to pay to those 2 kids in the shack." Norma nodded, wiping a fresh tear from her eye. "What do we do, George?" "We remember," he said firmly, "and we keep the promise. The promise I made to you in that cabin, that I would make it worth it. I don't think I'm done making it worth it yet." He stood up, his knees cracking slightly. He carefully placed the old Guild guitar back in its case, treating it with more reverence than he treated his Hall of Fame trophies. He slipped the tortoiseshell pick into his pocket, right next to his heart. "Come on," he said. "Let's get dry. Tomorrow is going to be a long day." The night passed in a strange, dreamless sleep. The storm had exhausted the atmosphere, leaving the air still and heavy. When George woke up, the sun was already streaming through the heavy curtains of the master bedroom. It was a bright, piercing Texas sun, the kind that promises heat and dries the earth into cracked puzzles. He sat up, half expecting the events of the previous night to fade like a dream. But the dampness of his canvas coat hanging on the valet stand was real. The mud on the tips of his boots by the door was real. He dressed quickly, pulling on fresh jeans and a clean shirt, but he skipped the starch. He put on his work boots. He went downstairs, the house silent and expansive around him. He found Norma in the kitchen, staring out the bay window with a cup of coffee in her hand. She turned as he entered. She didn't say anything, just handed him a mug. They drank in silence, both looking out at the south lawn. Under the harsh light of day, the lawn was impeccable. The green grass was vibrant, fed by the storm. The gazebo was gone, removed years ago, he remembered now, leaving a wide open space. "Let's go look," George said. They walked out the back door. The air was fresh, smelling of wet earth and ozone. The birds were singing with a frantic energy, celebrating the end of the rain. They walked the same path they had walked in the dark, but the terror was gone. Now it was a pilgrimage. They reached the spot. There was no cabin. There were no cinder blocks. There was no rusted tin roof. The landscape was empty, save for the rolling hills in the distance. But there, in the exact center of the open space, was the sapling. It stood about 18 inches high, a young, vigorous Texas red cedar. Its needles were a deep, waxy green, glistening with morning dew. The mud around its base was disturbed, as if it had been planted recently, but there were no footprints other than their own from the night before. George knelt down beside the tree. He reached out and touched the needles. They were sharp and stiff, real. He dug his fingers slightly into the soil at the base. It was cool and damp. "It's here," he said, his voice filled with awe. "It stayed." Norma knelt beside him. "It's a second chance, George, a symbol. That cabin burned down so we could live this life. But this tree is going to grow here. It's going to have deep roots." George looked at the vast expanse of his ranch. He saw the fences he had paid for, the barns he had built, the cattle grazing in the distance. He realized that for years he had been looking at this land as an asset, as a kingdom he had conquered. But looking at the small, fragile tree, he saw it differently. This land wasn't a trophy. It was a stewardship. It was the soil that had fed him when he was poor, and it was the soil that held him now that he was rich. "I'm going to build a fence around it," George said softly. "A small wooden fence. Just like the porch railing of the old cabin. I want to protect it. I want the grandkids to know that this tree is the most important thing on the ranch." "They'll ask why," Norma said, smiling. "And I'll tell them," George replied. "I'll tell them the story of the girl who saved a singer with a tin can of coins. I'll tell them that this tree grew out of a promise." He stood up and helped Norma to her feet. He looked at her, really looked at her in the morning light. The wrinkles on her face were maps of their journey. He leaned in and kissed her, a long, slow kiss that tasted of coffee and 50 years of devotion. "Thank you," he whispered against her lips, "for not letting me sell the guitar." "Thank you," she whispered back, "for playing it." They turned and began to walk back towards the house, but George stopped. He felt the pick in his pocket. He pulled it out. The sunlight caught the tortoiseshell, making it glow like amber. He looked at the mansion, then back at the sapling. "You go on inside, honey," George said. "I'll be there in a minute." Norma looked at him, understanding in her eyes. She squeezed his hand and walked towards the house, leaving him alone in the field. George walked back to the sapling. He sat down on the wet grass, crossing his legs. He wasn't George Strait, the icon. He was just George. He took a deep breath of the cedar-scented air. He began to hum. It wasn't a song for the radio. It wasn't a song for the fans. It was a melody that rose from the earth, traveled through the soles of his boots, and found its way to his throat. He hummed the tune of the rain. He hummed the tune of the fire in the wood stove. He realized that he didn't need the cabin to be there physically. The cabin was inside him. It was the place he went to when he closed his eyes on stage. It was the source of the blue clear sky. It was the ache in the chair. It had always been there. He just needed to clean the window to see it again. He looked up at the sky. A hawk was circling high above, riding the thermals. "I won't forget," George said aloud to the empty field. "I promise, I'll keep it country. I'll keep it real." He pushed himself up from the ground, brushing the grass from his jeans. He felt lighter than he had in years. The burden of maintaining the legend had evaporated, replaced by the simple joy of being a musician. He walked back to the house with a spring in his step. As he reached the back porch, he saw Norma waiting for him, holding the door open. "What are you going to do today?" she asked as he stepped into the kitchen. George smiled, a genuine, crooked grin that lit up his face. "I think I'm going to write a song," he said. "I think I finally found the hook I was looking for in 1974. He walked past her, heading towards the music room, his boots clicking on the hardwood floor. The house was quiet, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the echoes of the past and the music of the future. Outside, the small cedar sapling stood firm in the Texas wind, its roots already reaching down, searching for the water deep within the earth, anchoring the legacy of a man who almost gave up, but was saved by love, a tin can of coins, and the vision of a lighted window in the storm.